Hey guys, this is Master Flowers. This is a continuation of the beginnings of my homeworld setting where I came from. When I last left off, I was talking about the Dragon Wars and the beginnings of that, and the ascendant of Tiamat and Bahamut, where Sister and Magiacl, to counter the new demigod that has appeared in the celestial heavens, they rise, they elevate Bahamut. They turn him into the Platinum Dragon and then elevate him to the celestial, into the heavens, and he becomes a demigod as well. So, excuse me. So right now, as I create my world, I have basically three gods. I have Sister, and I have Magiacl, and I have Silk, and each one of those is, even though they don't lean towards law or chaos, you have Sister is a good god, Magiacl is a neutral god, and Silk is an evil god. More from the machinations of entropy whispering in his ear, but he always leaned more towards that than he would have as good. Now I have I have a chaotic evil god, demigod of dragons, evil dragons, and I have a lawful good demigod of the good dragons, Bahamut. And it stays like that for a long time. It goes through all through the Age of Dragons, and those battles between the dragons are extremely fierce, as you can imagine. It's not just a dozen dragons running into each other and attacking. It's hundreds of thousands of dragons, and if you can imagine a skyline where you know 20,000 dragons are battling each other on in the air, on the ground. The amount of magical might that's being thrown back and forth. The enormous power of the breath weapons. And just the sheer mass and power of these great worm dragons tearing and ripping into each other. Um, excuse me. It's a pretty awesome sight if you have the imagination to think of it. So during that time, um, in the Age of Dragons, probably about midway through it, where it started to basically, the first 10,000 years, everything was hunky dory, everything was great, and then entropy got involved, and then about take about 5,000 years before the dragons really started to kill each other, and basically the survivors of those great battles kind of separated. They really, they kind of picked out different zones, and they said, "Hey, I'll guard this zone. I'm not really on this super offensive fighting anymore." They're barely staying above the attrition rate. So they kind of all back off and they all go to their different areas. And in my world, that's why blacks live in swamps, or golds live in floating castles, or giant mountains. Basically, that was the best spot for them to hide. Basically, so once again, you have a primordial area. You have these super intelligent, super powerful creatures, the dragons, living in this age, but they're far and few between. They're not as prolific as they were. They've destroyed themselves. Anytime they come in contact, they fight each other, and there's even fighting amongst. It's not just the chromatics versus the metallics. It's the chromatics versus the other chromatics that they might not have the same opinion for, and the metallics tend to do the same thing. During that time, I had told you that in the creator's world, before everyone came back, basically a million years had gone by. And during that time, I had decided that I wanted races to be in my world, and I wanted them to be slightly different. I didn't want them all to be creations of Magiacl and Sister. And there were two ways in my mind that I could do that. I could bring them through that little entrance that Silk found, have them pass through it and head towards the planetoids and maybe land there or something like that, or fly through there through magic. Or I could open rifts or portals. As even though this void is blocked, it's a prison for entropy. You can actually, once you're in, you can actually create portals in and out. So basically, if you wanted to go to Tartarus, you could create a portal there, and you could bring demons through. And basically, originally I didn't want to do that, but then I would have had to create a whole separate a whole separate a whole separate demon land or devil land or whatever. And instead of it doing that, and I just wanted to keep the demons and devils that I knew from the monster manual or books I've read, I just made it so that portals would work. You could still summon things back and forth, though anything that's in this void can't go out. So entropy can't leave anyways, which is probably part of the reason why he didn't just outright destroy the planets and planetoids. It gives him something to mess with and play with throughout his lifetime, which is forever. So getting back to my point, in so doing, one of my favorite races is the Halfling. It's always been that way. And what I had done is I had figured over the million years, what if a combination of Spelljammer technology and psionically endowed race of Halflings, using the Spelljammer ships, not using the arcane or divine spellcasting to pilot them, but using psionic energies to pilot them, they had stretched out into space. And we kind of all know the Halflings are kind of they love exploration. They're basically fearless. They get their saves the fears, and so I thought they would make excellent explorers and gatherers for information. So once they started doing that spell jamming, where they were traveling around to all different planetoids, I had created this gigantic ship. When I drew it out, it looks just like the Battlestar Galactica ship, very very similar. And what I did was I assumed that the Halflings, who changed their name from Halfling to Hail Flynn, which is whatever, just a different way of pronouncing it, and they took this giant ship, which they called the Phoenix, and they flew it around, collecting different types of strange creatures that they had never seen, and they plan on collecting them all. And I'm not talking like Noah's Ark, 2 of each. I'm talking, they would huge family groups, because they wanted to take these populations and bring them back to their planet and keep them a living population. And you don't want to just have 2; you want to actually have more. So they traveled around doing all that, and on their journeys, one of the farthest planets that they were heading out to, they saw this tiny pinprick of light, and basically that was the doorway to the void that was open. And I had this ship; they flew into it. They're great explorers. How could they not? They didn't even know this existed. So they fly and they pass through that portal, and they come across you have the sun, and you have 2 stars, 2 constellations. You have Tiamat and the Bahamut constellation. Then you have the moon and the earth and a sun, and they fly in. And they were going to do a pass and just kind of look at it and see it, and they see all this immense life forms that are on all these. Using psionic energies, they detect that there's lots of life there, huge amounts of life, and they kind of get the hint that perhaps there are dragons, but they're not sure, because the dragons are fairly powerful and they shield themselves. So when they're flying in to get a better look at the planetoid, Entropy kind of does his little thing, and he gets in there and he kind of just tweaks the ship, and the ship crashes. It just, they have whatever he does, he just makes it so the ship crashes. So the Phoenix flies in and slams into the into the giant, into Wen'Thrae itself, and basically it didn't kill anyone. The ship basically survived, but it was never going to fly again. And the way magic works in my world is the Halflings don't have any magic abilities. Now this was fine, because back in first edition, Halflings didn't have magic abilities anyways. That wasn't part of the kit that they were allowed to do. Halflings, dwarves, they didn't cast spells. That wasn't part of who they were, though they did have the ability to get psionics. The chance of that is very low. So I was in line with the first and probably second edition more than I was for third and fourth and whatever afterwards. So in my mind, that's why the Halflings didn't have any magic ability. They just had the psionic ability. So these Hail Flynn, they get out, and I kind of imagine them, they would be bigger. I figure they'd probably be like 5.5 feet tall, through evolution. They just, better health, better food, better things, more advanced technology, they would get taller and bigger, just similar to what humans, how they grew. And as they're coming out and trying to survive in this primordial land, they find that a lot of the technology that they were using, like the magical stuff that they brought, didn't function. From their world. Their technology definitely didn't function, and anything that was magical that they could use, like close velvet kind or whatever, things like that anyone can just wear and use, those didn't function either, because the magic is different from the magic in this world. So basically, they had their psionic abilities, and they had their intelligence, but that was about all they had. And there are these giant dinosaurs, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and raptors, and all types of things that can crush and kill them easily. And on top of that, at the same time, the ship, when it crashed, had broken apart, and the creatures they had been picking up all throughout the universes, these Aberations, had escaped. They had fled out. Some of them died, some of them, stayed, but the majority of them left and moved out. So that was how I brought the Aberations into my world, and Magical Beasts, things that were totally weird to me, like the bullet or the owl bear, creatures that totally didn't fit with the scheme of a natural type world. So that's where they came from, and they spread out, and they obviously, most Aberations are stronger than the natural creatures. They have some sort of ability that lets them do something that they couldn't normally do, and they became more powerful, and they spread out throughout my world. Most of them going underground, because there really wasn't much of any races or anything underground at the time. Maybe a few dragons that had buried themselves down there, but nothing really would get in their way. So basically, the Hail Flynn, over the next couple millennia, they spread out. They knew they couldn't create a city. They couldn't stay in a giant pack. It was too hard to collect enough food. So they created it into small family groups, and they spread out all throughout my continents. And as time goes on, they actually start to shrink. They become shorter as the genetics for them start swapping back and forth. And being smaller, you need less food. You need less. It's easier to hide. These are all little things that help them to become smaller. And then they become the halflings that except that they have, they're more likely to have psionics. So yeah, so they're one of the. It's a little bit different. Is that the halflings are one of my first races that populate the planet, but they're not part of the planet, not part of the ecosystem, not part of the creation of the world. And that comes into part when, as far as divine magic goes, and the way that magic in my world works. And I'll explain that in another video, how magic works in my world. But needless to say, they're slightly apart than everything else, which is probably, they have their own abilities that they can do, and they're more likely to be psionic creatures. But they're, even though in 3.5 they allow them to be mages or sorcerers, you're still not going to really find halfling sorcerers or halfling. And if they are, they probably came through a rift. Because like I said, eventually rifts could be opened between different planes. And if someone passed through one of those rifts, say a halfling, and he bred with the halflings here, you would probably have a combination of the magic. But I'll explain more about the magic at another time. So I think I'm going to end it there. Basically, so what happens is, my gods create the dragons, and then through Entropy's workings and Silk's whisperings, they war with each other, and instead of being just one great race of dragons, they become, the chromatics and metallics, and they're always fighting and warring. And eventually they destroy each other so much that there's so few of them spread throughout the worlds that there's no longer a war technically going on, because they just don't run into each other anymore. And about 3/4 of the way through that age, the Halfling land on the planet, and they've released the Aberations and the Great Magical Beasts into my world, as well as the Halfling race, which becomes halflings. So I'm going to stop it there, and I think next we'll go on to will probably be magic, I think, on the next video that I'm going to do. So if you made it through all these guys, thanks. If you have any questions, just post them at the bottom. I mean, I'll definitely respond to any comments. And if you have long information, you need a lot of information, just get it from send me a PM, and I'll type it up completely to you. So thanks for watching, guys.